Good evening and welcome. I am Derbla Mitchell, Deputy Chair of our group, but also Chair of the National Engineering Policy Centre working on decarbonisation. I'm delighted to be chairing this event on addressing sustainable shipping. This is hosted by the Royal Academy of Engineering in conjunction with BAE Systems. As some of you may know, I'm quite familiar with airports and the steps they and airlines take to become more sustainable. But I'm delighted to be here to learn more about the challenges facing shipping. By way of general introduction, we're talking about a sector which is global by nature and of global economic importance. Shipping is a cost-effective way to move things around the world, and today accounts for about 80% of all trade. And yet, our reliance on this, we must recognise that this sector contributes 3% of global greenhouse gases. So therefore today there's a clear necessity to transform this industry, and I hope you will hear tonight not only about the challenges of decarbonisation, the implications of using more diverse range of fuels, and the need to create a more safe and secure working environment, both in operation and at the end of life. But I also hope to hear about the opportunities that exist to embrace technology and innovate across the whole life cycle. To help me explore these topics, I am joined this evening by Cathy Davies, who is Head of Strategy, Simulation and Synthetics at BAE Systems. Catherine Palmer, Global Head of Sustainability for Lloyd's Register Maritime, and is currently seconded to the UN High-Level Climate Change Champions Team as the shipping lead. And finally, Susan Gurbenek. And Susan is based at the University of Southampton, where she's Professor of Offshore Geotechnical Engineering and Deputy Director of the Southampton Marine and Maritime Institute. She's also Royal Academy of Engineering Chair of Emerging Technologies on Intelligent and Resilient Ocean Engineering. But I'm going to give each of them a chance to introduce themselves, but before doing so, I just wanted to remind you about a little housekeeping. We would recommend that you switch to gallery view to get the best viewer experience. We will, during the session, be welcoming questions from the audience, and you can submit these via the link that has been shared in the chat facility if you're joining us via Zoom. And for those of you who are joining us via the Academy's YouTube channel, you will also find a link pinned to the top of the chat facility. I will ask some questions initially to get the dialogue going, and then I hope to put as many of your questions as time permits to our panel in the latter part of this event. There is some moderation this evening, but that's only to help remove some of the duplicate questions that may arise. We want to cover as much ground as possible. So without further ado, let me hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves and to spend a couple of minutes each about their background, their organisation, and their areas of focus in their work, which is relevant to today's discussion. And will I start with you, Cathy?
Hi, thank you. So I'm Cathy Davies, Head of Strategy for Sustainability at BAE Systems. My background is engineering and technology across the maritime and defence sector over the last 20 to 25 years. My current role is really twofold, I suppose. So the first is to look at how we can help the business to reduce its product emissions, so the carbon emissions that we have in use and through the value chain. And secondly, it's also looking at how I can develop sustainable options going forward, so business growth based on the new products that we could see the market will need. I'm really pleased to be here, Derbla, so I'll pass on to Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Catherine Palmer. I am the Global Head of Sustainability at Lloyd's Register, but I am currently on secondment to the UN High-Level Climate Champions Team as the shipping lead. And in that role, we work with non-state actors in order to be able to mobilise commitment and action towards delivery of the Paris Agreement. So in my role as the shipping lead, I work across that non-state actor ecosystem within the shipping system and looking at all the different actions that different stakeholder groups can be taking to really drive zero emission shipping and to achieve our breakthrough targets in 2030 and 2040, as well as zero by 2050. Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you, Deborah. So yes, I'm a Professor of Offshore Geotechnical Engineering at the University of Southampton. So my background is in civil engineering, and I'm a specialist in geotechnics. And for the last 20 years, I've worked in the offshore sector. And so that is mostly around seabed engineering. So my work in the oceans is generally about structures that stay in one spot rather than ships as they move around. And my Royal Academy of Engineering Chair in Emerging Technologies is to help the broader decarbonisation agenda with provision of clean energy. So I'm also Deputy Director of this interdisciplinary Southampton Marine and Maritime Institute, and through that we get to address some of these large global marine and maritime challenges through the lens of multiple disciplines and with all sorts of actors from across industry of the third sector as well. And I'm here tonight particularly as a member of the Programme Board for the Engineering X Safer Engineered Life Programme and lead for the Safer Decommissioning of Offshore Structures Ships theme.
Great, thank you all. Now we have, three ladies here with different perspectives on this topic. And I'm going to go around in the same order again and ask you each to give your perspective, on the, contribution or value of shipping to society, and, what are the key sustainability challenges facing this sector? So,
okay, thank you. So I think as a leading defence company, BAE Systems' primary focus in the UK maritime sector is to provide the Royal Navy with the equipment that they need to defend the nation, both at home and abroad. And that's obviously a huge value to society. But our contribution to the economy is also important. So, for example, the Type 26 supports 4,000 jobs in the UK, and we invest over £1 billion investors in over 100 suppliers also in the UK. So that's really good. And we've got the ability to then export those products, generating more GDP growth. I think the piece that I wanted to major on though today is more about the STEM skills that we encourage, so the science, technology, engineering and math skills. So a defence vessel is a really complex engineering challenge. It requires specialist skills, and we're designing high-powered vessels, keeping ships moving at pace as they're required to maintain a hotel load for that crew on board. And I think to give you an example of how complex that challenge can be, the Queen Elizabeth carrier, our flagship, she has 80 megawatts of power in the propellers. So that's an equivalency of 50 high-speed trains. And managing that energy at sea is not just the only challenge. We have to manage that shore side as well. So when she comes into berth, we need to provide a power plant installation for her. That's equivalent to powering 27,000 homes. So, how we do that, we have teams that can support that development, that design of that combined heat power system that goes alongside what was in the case of the QEC was a 60-year-old power infrastructure. And we have to do that in a way that generates both, I suppose, an economic benefit to the Navy, so reducing the electricity cost of running that ship when she's shoreside, but also reducing the carbon emissions. And we've managed to do both, through the skills that we develop. So core skills, early careers, apprenticeships and universities is really important for that sustainable maritime future. In terms of the kind of challenges that we have going forward, I think there's three really major challenges for us. And the first of those is managing that through life emissions understanding. So we have to design today for a tomorrow which is really unknown. We have a lot of uncertainty of the new and evolving solutions, but we have a long longevity of our ships in the water. They're designed for at least 40 years, probably longer, and we need to enable those changes and the changes that we don't understand what they're like yet, so that we can actually have that sustainable future, because it's a journey, right? We're not going to do it all in one step. I think the second piece for me then would be economics and logistics of supply. So again, coming back to that fuels piece, there's a real challenge about what that new fuel will be, but also when that fuel becomes both economic and sustainable in terms of its supply to be able to get what we need where we want it. And it's easy to forget that we're actually really fortunate at the moment that we have, exactly what we need wherever we want it in the world. And changing that is changing a huge infrastructure going forward. And we've been doing a number of studies around that supply and the economics around that. And then the last one, I suppose, for me is that cultural piece. So it's really difficult to change from where we are today to that new normal. And from my perspective, we've got to support our customers to transition, but we also need to support our employees and that supply chain that we have to help that decarbonisation go through and make sure that it's an opportunity for everyone.
Thank you. There's great description of those challenges. So the same question to you, Catherine. You'll probably answer it in a different way, and maybe there'll be some overlapping areas. Let's see.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there might be some overlapping areas, but I think that's going to be great if we can pull out some themes that we all align around. I think your first part of that question is, what is the value of shipping to society? Well, I think, if we just look around our own daily lives, most of the things that we use, whether it be how we heat our homes, whether it be the food that we put on our table, this is all being shipped around the world. So if we think of the role of shipping and the value it adds to society, it is about enabling us as society to be able to grow and develop and to have that economic and sustainable development in nations around the world. So if we think our healthcare, our food, our energy, we've got to look at it from a supply chain perspective, and we need to keep these supply chains moving. They need to be resilient in an ever-changing world as well. So shipping is integral. So if we decarbonise shipping, we're essentially decarbonising global supply chains. And so shipping is really significant sector when we look at global climate action that is required. And like I said, so focusing on decarbonising shipping helps unlock benefits across the shipping systems. If we think of that connection with land and that connection upstream, shipping can unlock a lot of other societal benefits that bring in economic growth, green jobs creation, and also the connection to nature-based solutions and the connection to oceans, and how oceans are also a solution for climate change. So I think for me, the interconnectedness of shipping makes it such a significant sector for climate action, and like I said, unlocking those benefits, and shipping is a source of solutions. So when we say, well, what are the key challenges for shipping in decarbonisation? I think we're right, that it is those resilience benefits, not only for shipping supply chains, but how they unlock resilience further upstream. It is about the people and having a people-centred transition to ensure that we have a just and equitable transition and no one gets left behind. And it is then also around, like I said, this connection to the oceans, and how shipping as a significant ocean industry can contribute to ensuring that we have healthy oceans that are also a solution for climate change. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And Susan, again to you, the value and the challenges.
Thank you, Deborah. So as you and Catherine both mentioned, so 80% of global trade travels by ship. So most of the things that we consume in our daily lives has been on a ship at some point in its life. And so I think we can clearly see that we all rely on shipping for most of the things that we have in our daily lives. But of course, the shipping sector also supports livelihoods for millions of people around the globe and national economies, and across the whole life cycle of shipping, from that design and construction through operation and then to decommissioning. So I think that the value of the shipping sector is very clear. And then Kathy made those points about the bits that perhaps we see less in our day-to-day lives, that the defence sector, but equally important. And I suppose in terms of the challenges, I think the enormity of it, perhaps, that if shipping were a country, it would be the 8th largest international polluter with its 3% of global carbon emissions, and only set to increase with the increased global population and the increased movement of goods around the world. So clearly decarbonising the shipping sector is going to be an important role or an important step in sustainable shipping. But I think there are also some wider environmental and social challenges facing the shipping sector that also need addressing. And these include things like seafarer welfare. During the operational life of the ship, over 2 million seafarers around the world. And there are also human and environmental safety aspects at the end of the engineered life. So during decommissioning of ships when they're no longer operational. There's somewhere between 600 and 800 merchant vessels decommissioned each year, and the majority of those are decommissioned without adequate infrastructure and equipment and PPE for workers in a process called beaching, without adequate waste disposal pathways that can lead to contamination of that intertidal zone, the local environment and the wider ocean. So decarbonisation, a great challenge, certainly, but some of those wider societal and environmental challenges also.
I think the three of you have given us a great description of the sort of range of topics we might consider in a little bit more depth now. And I wonder if I might go to you, Catherine, next, and, talk us a little bit more about, shipping as a system and, the challenge, the sort of transition that's required to decarbonise,
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we've all touched on the fact that this isn't about a ship in isolation and a single asset. This is about supply chains and logistics, and how ocean freight is part of these global supply chains. And so then we look at the system. There are so many different stakeholders within that kind of shipping system, and those connectedness to ports, to cities, to nations. That is what I sort of, when we sort of say that the connectedness and the shipping system is that whole ecosystem of maritime actors, whether they range from finance, community, whether they are the end customer of shipping, and those that are involved in designing, operating, running the assets, and those maritime workers at ports, cargo handling, etc. So there's a wide ecosystem at play here. So when we look at what is the system transformation that is going to be needed to achieve zero emission shipping by 2050, it is significant. And we are literally moving from a sector that has been running on one type of energy source for decades, and we're now going to be shifting that sector to potentially a much more portfolio mix of energy, given the diversity of ships and their trade within the shipping sector. So and so that's why we sort of look at these different change levers. So we've got technology and supply as a key change lever. We've got policy as another enabler. We've got civil society and the role that they play. We've touched on whether it's labour organisations of those that work in the maritime sector, or whether it is civil society who live in port and coastal communities. And then we've got the finance community and the customer demand. And all these have got levers that they can pull and they can take action. But then collectively, we can create the change or the tipping points that are actually needed for shipping's transformation. And so at the moment, where are we? We're in this kind of emergent phase of the transition. And we have a target of 5% zero carbon fuel in international shipping's energy demand by 2030. And so that's our breakthrough target to put us on track to be able to achieve zero emission shipping by 2050.
Kathy, I wonder if I might go to you next. Coming from an industry perspective, what are the key areas that, you're focusing on? And I'm just looking a little bit at the questions that are beginning to come in. Yes, please, audience, send in your questions, but there are stuff about, energy, fuel efficiency. I'm looking at, anyway, so I think, tell us about, what should the areas of focus?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because we do tend to think about, I suppose, some different epochs in terms of what's going to happen. So energy efficiency and optimization would be the first thing that I would think about. And then we start to look at what the new fuels might be. And, as I alluded to earlier, we've had quite a long look at some of the fuels and the options that we've got, because it does matter to us. Smaller vessels, we can move quite easily to a hybrid electric drive solution. It's quite viable with the smaller vessels, although there are limitations with that as well. But for the larger ships, traditionally we actually design around we design the hull around that integrated power and propulsion system and the fuel tanks and all that sort of thing. And because of the differences in the fuels that are coming forward, there's quite a big difference in how you would design that system. So the kind of simplistic, I suppose, thing to look at is the volume of fuel that you require to do exactly the same as you do today. And if you change to certain fuels, you're doubling that fuel tank size. So, how would you do that as a retrofit? That's really quite challenging, unless you're going to kind of cut your ship in half and put an extra tank in the middle and then sew it all up, And I think these are the things that they seem on the first point to be really simple, but actually it's not. And then when you look at the choice of fuel and the way that the market will be fragmented to use different types of fuel in the future, that also provides quite a challenge, because the fuels that I suppose we might want for our sector might be more costly. They might be harder to access and supply in particular places. And so those sorts of things become other aspects that we have to think about in that design and think about how we can move forward. Not least that they've all, of course, got different properties about them. And so actually, the safety, the regulations that you might have around that also change dependent on the fuel that you're going to do. That's something we'd have to think about going forward. I think we can also look at design from another way of reducing carbon emissions. So we can actually do more within our operations to reduce those emissions. And we have our targets that we've set within the business. So we're looking at our own scope 1 and 2, so the operations of our sites, down to net zero by 2030. And the value chain obviously is 2050 in line with the UK legislation. But as we do some of that, some of the digital aspects of those designs become more important. So what we might think is, from a usage perspective is important. Actually, the more we can do to design that ship in a simulated and synthetic environment, to do our virtual testing of it before we cut steel, the better for the environment. And similarly, we can then look at the way we operate those ships. So, there are plenty of examples in the commercial sector where they have fuel algorithms that actually reduce the speed of the vessel to account for economics. We could do that for sustainable outputs as well to make things better that way. And that's not quite as transferable into the defence sector. We tend to want to be somewhere quite quickly, but there are ways of utilising some of those algorithms to improve performance and that optimisation. So that's all really interesting. But yes, supply is going to be a huge challenge there going forward.
Thanks, Kathy. Susan, I'm going to change direction a little bit and ask you to talk to us about the social equity, the labour, the human rights issue, that currently come about at the end of life, and how might we address these in a more decarbonised world?
Okay,
but maybe expand first of all on the problems.
Okay, thank you, Dervla. So I think a key inequality is that, as we've heard, we all benefit. There is a global benefit derived from shipping during their operational lives, but the risks associated with decommissioning are disproportionately focused in particular places, and in particular in South Asia. And in just 2020, 70% of the world's end-of-life ships were decommissioned on 3 strips of coastline in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And decommissioning on these beaches typically takes place by this process where the ships are pulled up onto the intertidal zone, and there is very little or inadequate infrastructure and equipment for the cutting. There's poor or no waste disposal pathways. Vessels arrive laden with toxic materials that legally should have been disclosed and disposed of before reaching the beach. And workers and communities and the environment are harmed as a result of that. And there are additional issues such as the use of children in the labour force in shipbreaking yards and practices where there is a lack of regulation. So the International Labour Organization classifies shipbreaking as being amongst the world's most dangerous occupations with unacceptably high levels of fatalities, injuries, and related diseases. And that lack of hazardous waste management also has severe consequences for the surrounding communities and the environment. And so why does all this happen? Well, because shipbreaking takes place where it's cheapest to carry it out. And this is where the operations are unregulated and the workers' rights are poorly or unrepresented. But those local communities, they rely on the shipbreaking industry for livelihoods. The countries that carry out the most shipbreaking activities rely on that sector in their economies. In Bangladesh, for example, the shipbreaking sector directly supports tens, 50,000 or more workers and hundreds of thousands indirectly through the recycling process of the materials from the shipbreaking. So it's important to acknowledge that it is an issue for the international community to address. So while the regulation, the law and the market permit that unsafe decommissioning, ships, the individual yards and the workers cannot really respond. So for international regulation requires ships to be decommissioned in a safer way that protected worker safety and the environment, then the industry could level up. So there are various legal practices that permit that status quo, and the economic imbalances that would allow the different operations to take place are likely to affect businesses and communities in the short term economically that will have a very real and immediate impact on all of those people. So that's really sort of setting out, I suppose, the challenge that you said to articulate and set out. And in terms of how decommissioning might change some of these challenges, well, I think that actually many of the technical end of engineered life challenges for ships and related infrastructure are going to be similar. As the sector decarbonises, you're going to need to deal with fuel contaminated vessels and infrastructure and future clean fuels while they reduce or eliminate carbon emissions at the point of burning. And indeed, hopefully in the life cycle of their production, they're still combustible and potentially unstable and toxic and corrosive substances that need to be managed appropriately at the end of their engineered life. So those waste stream management systems do need to be put in place at decommissioning yards. And of course, the wider diversity of fuels that are available in a decommissioned landscape, the more complicated that might be. And I suppose equally those same economic levers and the regulatory instruments that enable the safety challenges to perpetuate could equally perpetuate irrespective of the sort of decarbonised future scenario. But I would say that the changes in the technical aspects of the fuels and the vessels and that consequent need for the revised decommissioning processes, and whether that's the infrastructure or the policy, for example, that does provide an opportunity for changes in those economic and regulatory systems to be introduced anew. And while there might seem to be a little excuse for not being able to change those levers and regulations now for conventional fuels, if decarbonisation of shipping can create that sector-wide disruption to enable status quo to be shifted, and create a safer and more responsible ship breaking or decommissioning practices, then I think that would be an excellent outcome. For me, I'd just like to talk about a few more specific activities that are really taking place now to address some of those end of engineered life challenges for offshore structures and ships. Because there are really a few organisations who are doing some fantastic work around sustainability in shipping in general, but also for end of engineered life. The Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative, which is part of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, is a relatively recent platform for voluntary disclosure on ship recycling. So to try and start that conversation and make it public, so big ship owners are encouraged to disclose their ship decommissioning practices. And the NGO Shipbreaking Platform is a global coalition of organisations that work to sort of raise awareness of shipbreaking practices. They collect fantastic data sets and work to reverse the environmental harm and human rights abuses that do take place in some current shipbreaking yards. But in particular, I'd like to touch on a programme that is run through the Academy with its Engineering X partnership with the Lloyd's Register Foundation on safer end of engineered life. And this raises awareness, it builds partnerships in communities and supports various projects to improve safety and decommissioning offshore structures and ships where the risks are most prevalent. So currently this Engineering X Safer Decommissioning of Offshore Structures and Ships programme is supporting 6 projects to tackle some really critical safety issues, many of which we've touched on tonight. And each of these projects, it comprises multinational teams from across the sector and across disciplines and are addressing issues such as transparency in ship recycling, the rights of the affected communities, safety envelopes and risk assessment in Bangladeshi shipbreaking yards, regionally specific requirements for decommissioning in Southeast Asia, and the creation of a global baseline of assets to be decommissioned, current infrastructure and regulatory frameworks. Each of these projects either contributes insights or evidence to base future regulatory change on, or enables us to develop geographically appropriate safe practices for ship recycling, so that they can continue to support the economies and the livelihood of the countries where ship recycling is really a key sector. So I don't know whether I should keep going, but what I want to say is, although it's a multidisciplinary problem, there are clearly it's a big system challenge with lots of socio and economic and regulatory challenges. I think there is a place for all sorts of engineering to really contribute significantly here, whether there are civil engineers to develop the infrastructure that is needed, the mechanical engineers to adapt the equipment that is needed, whether it's chemical engineers to guide on that identification of safe handling of hazardous materials, electrical engineers to develop monitoring systems to alert of those dangerous situations in the shipyards to prevent accidents, or software engineers to develop tracking apps to try and undo some of these poor and illegal operations.
So you're calling upon all the engineers in the audience to tell them that they have a role to play. And I would say to you, whether it's a role to play in decarbonising shipping, you also have a role to play in decarbonising the world wherever you work. But I want to move to Catherine again. You know, events like COP26 bring about an energy and a sort of a public opinion which helps bring about change. Can you tell us a little bit about COP26, what happened and what we might expect in the coming years, maybe, or the coming year in COP27?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think comparative to previous COPs, I would say that, you know, COP26 was quite unprecedented for shipping. The focus on shipping has shifted. If we look at what has happened, you know, both from a state perspective, you know, governments are starting to really realize the value and the significance of shipping and becoming much more salient towards wanting to take action in shipping. And also we have seen over the last year, 18 months, significant industry alignment, particularly around the long-term goal. So that alignment around zero emission shipping by 2050 from the industry, that is there now, which it wasn't previously. And like I said, government's much more salient towards tackling shipping emissions. So a few of the big declarations that occurred at COP26, we had the zero emission shipping by 2050 declaration, which was at the time was signed by 40 countries, but obviously that declaration is still alive, and there's still a lot of effort to get more signatories to sign up to that long-term, long-run intent. And then also we had the Clydebank Declaration, which was, again, at the time, 22 countries signed up to the Clydebank Declaration, which is a commitment to work in the near short term on the creation of green corridors in shipping. And so when we look now at what is the focus, 2022 is the year of turning commitments into action. So by the time we get to COP27, it's very much about demonstrating action rather, and so green corridors are going to be a particular focus of 2022. And so, you'll start to see consortiums being mobilized around green corridors. And these are full value chain, public-private partnerships. This is not, it can be done by one particular stakeholder, or it can just be done by the private sector and doesn't involve the public sector. So we're going to start to see these. And essentially they will be a kind of living lab where we can try, whether it's different fuels and different technologies, we can try different commercial models, because we need to have innovative commercial models for operating zero emission ships. It's not just around the fuel and the technology. And also we can bring in the people center side of things when we start to look at, well, what are the skills that are going to be needed to operate zero emission ships, and how are they different to the skills that we have from our seafaring community today. So green corridors really are the focus of 2022. So hoping by COP27, we've got some best practice, we've got some roadmaps set out, we've got consortiums built, and we've got these public-private partnerships working together to try and solve some of these complex challenges that we've all highlighted today.
It's really interesting to hear that, it's collaborative working, it's partnerships, and that people are trialing different solutions, because this is a very complex system with many different potential outcomes or solutions. So I look forward to hearing more about that in the coming year. Now, I think it's time to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. And so I'm going to look at those now. And the first one that catches my eye here, it's been highlighted for me. If not covered by the panel, what impact will biocidal anti-fouling coatings have for industry, especially improving a vessel's sustainability? Kathy, that might be yours.
I'm not sure that is. I'm not best placed to talk about anti-fouling coatings. We do use some for our ships, and we do other things on the ships that actually help us keep the hulls clean. And there's a lot of maintenance that goes on, but this isn't my area of expertise, I'm afraid.
I think it said if the panel didn't cover it. Does anyone else have anything on anti-fouling? No, I think not. So forgive us for that one. What are the strategies to make a balance between the decarbonisation of shipping and the cost competitiveness in the shipping business? I'm sure you all would like to have a go at that, but who would like to try that one first?
I'm happy to take that first. So I think one of the key, so we know at the moment, currently zero emission fuels are much more expensive than the fossil fuels that we currently are available today. But as we have seen with renewable electricity, if we look at that cost parity between solar energy and fossil energy, we know that the costs can be equal. And as renewable energy prices come down, that means that the cost of production of zero emission fuels, because it is highly likely that the zero emission fuels will be green hydrogen based, and so they're produced from renewable electricity. Costs are coming down, and so demand will go up, and so we'll have that kind of supply demand dynamics. But there is going to be a point where we've got zero emission ships competing in the market with fossil fueled ships. Mm-hmm. And the fuel price is significantly different between the two. So how do we level that out? Mm-hmm. And that's where policy mechanisms come into play. And so when we start talking about applying a carbon price to shipping. And so in order to close that competitiveness gap between ships operating in the same market but have significantly different operating costs due to the fuel, it's going to be that need for a carbon pricing mechanism to apply to shipping.
And when do you think we're going to reach that point of carbon pricing? If you have a time scale on that?
I don't have a time scale on that, but the need would be that it would need to come into effect by 2025.
I can answer.
But obviously, with the IMO will intersessional working group this year will really focus on the midterm measures package, and so it will be a package of measures, of which hopefully a carbon pricing mechanism would be part of that package.
Yeah. Kathy, you have to add to that.
Yes, I can add to that, because we've been looking at some of the carbon pricing, and in particular, I suppose, the EU carbon import tax, which is going to apply from 26. So my understanding is that's going to be about £80 per tonne of carbon emitted as an import arrives at the EU. That's quite a substantial figure. And, the kind of, I think what's really interesting here is the price of fuels at the moment is really high, of a green fuel relative to a fossil fuel. And we're talking anywhere between 5 and 14 times that price of fuel, depending on the source. So, there is this challenge. I know, Catherine, you talked about green hydrogen and the amount of renewables that we can use to create that. But actually, if we go to more the SAF position, we're probably talking about a significant cost to make the synthetic fuel after we've got that green hydrogen, because there's a number of things that need to be done there. So actually, it's, for me, there's an awful lot of there's an awful lot more that we need to do to get to that carbon pricing position where we can actually play on a level playing field, and I suppose really kind of encourage people to invest in these new technologies. Because the other thing here in the back of my head is that whole Betamax argument. We actually don't know the right thing to invest in, but these investments are enormous. I went to a conference recently where Shell presented, and they talked about 5,000 to 7,000 new fuel plants will be required to replace the current global supply. I mean, that's phenomenal.
Somebody has piano practice on in the background.
That's me, I'm afraid.
No, I just want to say we're going to keep going with it. It's normal family life, so don't worry about that. So I'm going to go to another fuel question rather than the one that's highlighted for me, because I think it's related. Is even considering the use of highly toxic to humans and aquatic life fuel for long distance shipping, such as ammonia, really sensible or ethical? There's a great hesitation there. Is ammonia considered a fuel?
So it is considered a fuel. Personally, I'm on the same page, I think, as the person who's asked the question. We wouldn't advocate ammonia from our perspective at the moment. We're probably more towards the synthetic fuels. Yeah, I mean, if you have a leak, it's very difficult.
Yeah. Catherine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would add to that. You know, green ammonia is being considered as a potential fuel for shipping. I think, as with you know, yes, you know, we do need to understand environmental impacts from any potential spill, as we do with any. You know, we've got spills with heavy fuel oil today that have significant environmental impact as well. You know, and then also there's a lot of work going on at the moment around the safety aspects. And I think, you know, as we start to understand more around the hazards and the safety aspects of operating on ammonia on board ships, you know, if they can be mitigated to a level of risk that is acceptable. And I think that's where we need to wait and see the outcomes of those experts that are working to understand the risks and hazards around ammonia used on board ships. But obviously, when we look at it as a potential within the mix with others, from a cost competitive perspective, it does look promising. And like I said, you know, we will be looking at a fuel that is going to be green hydrogen derived in the long term. But, you know, like you said, you know, what you do with that, do you convert it to ammonia, or do you then convert it to other synthetics, which has additional production processes which add additional cost to it? So who knows?
So keep considering a multiplicity of answers, but keeping an eye on those environmental, ethical issues as well. Now, a different question. What are the skills needed to address the sustainability challenges in shipping? Now, Susan mentioned quite a few of those earlier, so I don't know if Kathy or Catherine want to make some more suggestions or cover that.
Yes, I will. I think, you know, we've obviously talked about the core skills around power and electrical engineering and that kind of piece. I think what's probably the skill that we really need to develop is around that carbon footprinting and understanding the through life impact of any change that you're going to make. So, you know, we've just had a really interesting conversation about fuels, but actually, you know, if we look at how that goes through the whole life cycle, a biofuel, for example, is not nearly so green as a electrofuel. And so, you know, there's actually a number of challenges. You know, I recently read something on hydrogen as well, where potentially that's not so good for the environment either. So understanding those trade-offs from a performance perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and from an economic perspective, and what's the best option, that's a really tricky challenge. So I think that's the key area to start upskilling people. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm only going to give half of the last question. Is what is the role of wind technologists? Who would like that one?
I'm happy, Isabella. So I love looking at the wind technologies that come through, and there are some great images of future ships with, you know, 46-foot sails on the top of them and that sort of thing that are all automated. From a defence perspective, it's unlikely we'd go to that sort of capability, but I can see pull through into a commercial sector where the top side of the vessel, so that the decks of the vessel are clearer for other things. But I do think there's a wealth of technology that's coming through, and there's an awful lot that we can take on from both the universities and thinking about how we do things differently with this technology. And, you know, I suppose I could give you a couple of examples for that. Working with Southampton, we've been sponsoring a PhD on acoustic cloaking. So that's it's kind of a principle that's similar to noise cancelling headphones, but for the marine environment. And you might ask, well, why would we want to do that? I mean, there are benefits to defence, but there are also benefits to ships in the sense that you can improve the environment for the crew and perhaps use spaces next to the engine areas that you wouldn't have used in the past because they were too noisy. And obviously you can also improve things for marine life. So these are kind of technologies that come through that we can utilize in different ways, you know. So I think we should be looking at that broader scan, what we can do better.
Great. Thank you. We're coming into the last sort of 9 minutes of this session. So I wanted to give each of you an opportunity, and I will start with Susan, an opportunity, you know, to leave the audience with 2 or 3 key takeaways, because what we've heard this today is it's quite a fragmented, diverse, diffuse, complex system, and that there are also many, many opportunities to address decarbonisation. So what are your key takeaways, Susan?
Okay, thank you, Deborah. I agree, it has been a wide-ranging discussion, and complex challenges have been put forward. Clearly, decarbonisation through design and operation is very important, but we do need to make sure that those wider environmental and social challenges are also considered. I think there's clear intersection with engineering ethics, the need for us to ensure that those difficult questions are raised and discussed and addressed across the engineering processes to achieve just solutions for all of the people involved in the sector. And I think the decarbonisation transition could really provide an opportunity to start some of those necessary conversations. And one thing I did want to pick up on again was really this the challenge of the massive amount of renewable energy generation capacity that is going to be needed in order to make truly clean future electro-fuels. And I mean, for example, in the 6th UK carbon budget, the high liquid fuel scenario predicts a need of 230 gigawatts of renewable electricity by 2050. And if we compare that to what we have now, and particularly in my field in the offshore, we have 10 gigawatts of currently installed offshore wind capacity now, a prediction of 40 by 2030, so in the next 9 years. And if you continue that trajectory along the high fuel scenario for the 6th carbon budget, we're looking at installing 1 to 3 offshore wind turbines a day between now and 2050. So this in itself is a really massive engineering challenge in order to support these other decarbonisation challenges. So I think, yeah, not to overlook that, and the investment in skills and the research and innovation and that forward-looking and progressive regulation in renewable energy is equally critical. Thank you.
Those challenges are also great opportunities. So, Catherine, what are your few key takeaways?
Yeah, thank you. I think you said the word. I think, you know, there is a significant opportunity for shipping here to really, I said, lead the way. You know, try and grapple with some of these significant, complex challenges that other sectors have to face as well, other nations have to face, particularly when we start talking around a just and equitable transition. You know, the shipping sector has uniqueness to it, you know, in the sense that it has a global regulator, you know, and if we can use that to advantage, to be able to say, you know, this is how we can deal with just an equitable transition for shipping through a global regulator. It shows in other platforms and other UNFCCC mechanisms that, you know, we can find ways through some of these really challenging issues that we have to deal with. So I think what I would say is, you know, shipping's transition to zero carbon is an opportunity. It's not something to sit and wait that it's going to be done to you. It's something that there is short-term action that can be taken now, whether that is through reducing your energy demand through some of these efficiency measures, or whether it is about taking part in innovation projects and green corridor programs and learning. And I think the cultural element of sharing the learnings from these R&D and innovation projects is critical, so that we don't leave anyone behind and we can all decarbonize. But just accepting that everyone's going to move at a different pace. This isn't, the whole sector's not going to move together. There are going to be first movers, but learnings are going to be shared from those first mover projects so that everyone can benefit and achieve decarbonisation. Thank you.
And Kathy, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, I think, my three takeaways, I suppose, we've talked about the economics and the logistics. It's a really difficult journey. There's no single answer, is there? But it will take investment. It takes a lot of hard work to get there. And we must do that through a through-life lens. So I really want people to think very hard about the intervention they make at one particular bit and make sure that it's not kind of just squeezing that balloon bubble and causing a challenge somewhere else instead. But the last piece, I think, echoes very much what Catherine's just said. It's about collaboration and co-creation. And ultimately, there's a culture that we need to have here that adopts change, embraces the opportunity, and skills up people to enable this to happen, because it's a great place to be. We can do this.
Super. Well, I'd like to thank each of you for your contributions this evening, and I'd also like to thank our audience. I hope you have all enjoyed the discussion and come away, like me, a little bit more knowledgeable, but also quite positive about the things that we can all achieve. And I think in collaboration was a really key point Kathy brought out there at the end. So hopefully we look forward to seeing more initiatives taking place before COP27, and we'll see these green corridors, and we'll see investment in new technologies and change. So on that positive note, I want to say thank you all for joining us, and apologies to those whose questions I did not get to, but I have to keep to time and finish up, I think, just about now or in a minute or two. So, yeah, thank you all and good night.